then I start with that. So yeah, so this team is part of my kind of political turn, one could say, for me personally, like looking not only at the ethics of technologies, but also the political aspects. And then within those political aspects, going to the global level, global problems. Let me try, because I don't know if I can change a slide like this. Yeah, maybe like this. Yeah, so what I want to do is say something about those global challenges and then go to a topic that should hopefully be of interest to environmental philosophers, namely climate, where I ask questions about how to deal with climate change, and focus on the principle of freedom. What does freedom mean there? And that, yeah, mainly based on the book Green Leviathan, where you use conceptual analysis of freedom in order to say something about this, and also link climate change with discussions about AI. So part one I call unnecessary and unhelpful walls. So I think we have this multiple crisis, right? Environmental, energy, technological, political, and so on. And environmental crisis is one of them. So one way from the academic side, I think that is unhelpful is to split technology ethics and environmental ethics here. Even if you don't consider AI, technology plays a huge role in the way we deal with non-human nature. Also, the very term nature is problematic. Nature versus culture, humans versus non-humans. So that also doesn't help. I'm inspired by Bruno Latour, but also other people that question dualistic modern approaches to these issues. Yeah, would like to see this presentation, this talk, lecture as part of what we do in CETE-P, also connecting environmental and technology ethics. So some obvious connections in general are that yeah, technology has impact on the environment. I already said something about what is nature, what is technology. Also, yeah, imaginaries, narratives that we have today are often techno-solutionist, and meaning that all problems should be solved by, can and should be solved by technology. And so there are many narratives in that direction where non-human nature is seen as something that needs to be mastered, overcome. So something that yeah, the opposite basically of non-modern attitudes to the environment. And unless we are reminded about Earth, we forgot about it in philosophy mainly. And so we are lucky to live today that we have so many people that now do think it's important to think about Earth, think about nature, ecosystems. From my side, what I've done is to look at moral status ascription, and there I've proposed a more relational approach to that. So that is relevant to nature in the sense that when we think about the status of animals, for example, to take a more relational approach. Environmental skill, I've questioned the relation we have towards nature, which is basically, I think, too modern and too romantic. And then I've asked, like, yeah, what would be then the alternative to that? So I looked at these problems with knowledge. In terms of yeah, generally thinking about moral status and value, I've also done work about what's intrinsic value. And there I also combined both natural and artificial. And of course, then already since the summer of 22, we yeah, it was announced already. The CETE-P is now fully operational and alive, and I'm glad we can do this also as CETE-P. But so to bring technology ethics to environmental ethics and vice versa, and also in addition to bring political philosophy to technology ethics and political philosophy to environmental ethics. Both are important because, again, this distinction and division between humans and non-humans, between things and words. So the political is often seen as something that humans do with words. Think also about the work of Hannah Arendt, who I think brought this out very clearly, that in Western philosophy, since Aristotle, we have this, that political action is something you do with words, and everything that has to do with technology is tucked away in in labor, in work, those categories, and is seen as non-political, and this is very problematic. And for example, feminist writers have done some good work on trying to show that also, for example, in the context of family and household, that there's politics going on. So this distinction has and should be questioned. In using words and things, I also have questioned this distinction. So this is all kind of support for doing political philosophy in philosophy of technology and more generally. And I think with regard to climate change, we can do the same. In the area of thinking about AI, you already see that it's quite recognized that things are political. For example, issues such as bias. What is less recognized is that technology itself is deeply political. So technology is usually just seen as an instrument, and then it's said like, yeah, it just depends what humans do with it. But in fact, if we look at technologies such as facial recognition here, there is politics in the technology, in the sense that in this case, the technology was biased against faces that were not white. In philosophy of technology, there is already thinking about the politics of artifacts for a while, since the 80s. Langdon Winner is an important figure there. But I think political philosophy should also be used both in philosophy of technology and environmental philosophy. And in this paper, I've brought some things together: AI for climate, but also in the already mentioned book. I don't think freedom is the only issue here. This is just one political principle that I talk about, but of course, all these other things are important too, also democracy. In the political philosophy of AI, I've enumerated some of these issues regarding AI. There's a kind of global and geopolitical aspect to this, and there we meet, of course, then also climate change as one big issue at a global level. So for me, both climate change and AI are two global issues. And it's interesting to think also about the governance of these issues, like how should we deal with them? And I think that's also philosophically an interesting topic, because it's about questions where power should lie, legitimacy, how to organize democracy, and so on. The climate issue, given the urgency, I think it's really nice to connect with climate change. I personally think a global approach there is important. I just published some arguments for that. But in this lecture, I want to really focus on freedom and climate change. So if climate change is really this important crisis, then we need to also use our academic resources for this. It's clearly a political issue, but technology is also a political issue. So let's first talk a bit about AI and climate change, and then go into the issues of about freedom. So at the global level, AI can be seen as as part of the solution, because we can, for example, gather data on temperature change, carbon emissions, predict weather events, also extreme weather, manage energy consumption better, look at transportation and see how that can be optimized. So it's clear that AI is a solution, as part of the solution at least. Geoengineering is also proposed by people, and one potential option that I thought about mainly was nudging consumer behavior, and then we will talk about it more in the context of issues concerning freedom there. But I'm not a techno solutionist, so I think AI is also really part of the problem, and yeah, that can be all kind of ethical issues, for example, attribution of responsibility. But I think it also are issues that are politically relevant and that have to do with, first of all, the electricity used by data centers, also the AI that is used to extract fossil fuels, the use of new electronic gadgets, and all the waste related to that. So basically, AI comes often in the form of machine learning and including these large language models. They need a lot of energy. That's by now quite known. So yeah, if we want to use AI to solve anything, I think we should also look at the sustainability and climate impact of AI itself, and AI not only as this device at one particular moment, but also AI as being produced somewhere, requiring energy, resources, AI having all these devices having a life cycle. Now, behind those kind of, for me, quite obvious problems, there's also, I think, larger philosophical problem of how we deal with non-human nature, how we deal with Earth. One way to talk about that is Anthropocene, the modern desire to control everything behind that also. So idea of Anthropocene is that human agency on Earth has increased to such an extent that humanity has become a geological force. So one could say that humanity has assumed this kind of hyper agency. And then that connects again with my interest in modernity, non-modernity. Can there be like another kind of attitude of humanity at large and also at the individual level towards non-human nature? I think that there can be, but it's not so easy to articulate this. Now, in this lecture, I want to focus on the political challenges, which I think also have to do with modernity. But we can focus on one particular principle here, and that's political freedom. So we have this problem of climate change. What can we do about it? One issue I already mentioned was nudging. So it would be great, of course, if behavior would be more climate friendly. So what we could do is tell people what to do. That is one solution, but this takes away negative freedom, as we'll call it later. Nudging claims to not do that. So let's look in more detail. So nudging, climate nudging, let's say, would influence human choices and behavior towards more climate-friendly directions by altering the choice architecture, as Sunstein and Taylor call it. So you change the decision environment. For example, in the supermarket, if you want that people eat more fruits, you put fruits there where now are usually the things that are regarded as bad for your health. So, of course, consumer behavior is already highly manipulated. Nudging is already used there. And here the idea would be some kind of green nudging, climate nudging, where you encourage people to buy things that are good for climate, or buy services that are not so bad for climate. So what is attractive about it is that according to nudging enthusiasts, that freedom is preserved since there is no coercion. You don't force people to do something, to change behavior. But so in that sense, it's a libertarian paternalism, but it's still a kind of paternalism. It's still the decision makers, the policy makers, politicians saying like, yeah, we should do something about climate change, and then we're going to try to change your behavior for your own good. And so that fails to respect human autonomy, this paternalistic attitude on the one hand, and on the other hand, also the actual, if you look at the mechanics of it, the actual subconscious influencing that bypasses autonomous and rational decision making. So it's quite clear that there is this undercutting of human autonomy. And then the question is like, should we do this, right? So should we not only persuade people by a rational argument, which would respect autonomy, and should we use these kind of non-liberal methods in a way, because it's about a covert manipulation of citizen choices and behavior. And one could argue that that has no place in a liberal democracy. But of course, the question is like, how great is liberal democracy when you at the same time then have the climate change going wild and ecosystems being destroyed. So this is really, I think, where there's like a political challenge when it comes to those different values, and freedom is and should be one of them. When we look at the global level, we definitely see that there is no or not sufficient coordination. There is not really an effective kind of global governance of the problem of climate change, in spite of all the awareness that also politicians claim to have. One could argue that human intelligence is not sufficient to deal with the complexity of the problem, that we need AI. And so AI again comes up here in a different function, namely not human decision makers, but AI that is going to use all these methods of manipulation or even coercion to solve things. So that is pushing the dilemma even further, because of course this could be a very effective way of dealing with the problem, but is it a legitimate and justifiable way, is then a question that we can ask by the help of political philosophy. And so I will go more in that soon when I say more about the book Green Leviathan. There's also, next to freedom, of course, other problems, for example, justice, right? So if we don't do anything, certain parts of the globe, and therefore certain people rather than other people, for example, people living in Pacific Islands or regions with long droughts or already vulnerable to floods, will suffer more. So this clearly has also a justice aspect. Also knowledge might be shared not equally, and there's an intergenerational aspect also to climate change. So we will make now decisions that affect later generations. So this is generally in political philosophy, I think, also then a complex issue to deal with, given all these values and that are at stake. I think values and principles that are also relevant for thinking about both freedom and AI. For example, if you do nudging, one can ask like, who bears the cost in terms of freedom? So if you massively influence and manipulate consumer behavior, maybe that's needed for effectively dealing with climate change, but it's clear that some people will also bear the cost of that in terms of freedom. So people who don't have freedom yet, or not much freedom, might not feel this, but people in the West here will feel it. So different parts of the globe, different demographies will bear different costs. So this is kind of creating a quite complex political problem. there's also a point about urgency here, because one could argue like, yeah, you're talking about AI, but maybe AI is not the main issue for some people, right? Poverty, lack of clean water, malaria, and so on might have to be prioritized. And even climate change might be perceived as a non-priority. So how to deal with this? I mean, I don't have like I don't have an answer to that, but it's something that shows that this problem is highly political, right? And why I say that is that because there is again this techno-solutionist push where engineering solutions are proposed, and the complexity of these political issues are not discussed, including these problems with freedom, including issues concerning justice and colonialism. Another question that should be asked to clear the ground before I go into the freedom question is who should deal with the ethical and political challenges? That was already the question about costs. Yeah, should the cost be spread to everyone, or should the 1% who cause most of the problems bear most of the costs? Also, yeah, this connects with the problem of responsibility for this, right? So who is responsible? Also with generations, could it be that previous generations are responsible for the current situation? Should they pay more to and then be more responsible, take more responsibility? And also the typical problem both in ethics and political philosophy, like how to balance different principles. Yeah, methods have been proposed, but it remains a problem. For example, in ethics, reflective equilibrium is used in the medical sector. In politics, actually, I don't think there is really a good method that has been proposed, but it's always a question of this of trade-offs between these principles when you start arguing for this. In any case, it's good, I think, to not reduce this to a technological issue and to talk about the politics, and of course then yeah, to reject views that narrow down things to the individual ethical level. And this also has an educational aspect that yeah, if we really are serious about that education should not only be about giving people skill for the economy, whatever that means, but should also be an education that works towards creating people in a way that can also help to solve local and global problems. Then we need also a radically interdisciplinary approach to deal with that, because otherwise you get things like techno-solutionism on the one hand, and on the other hand, people in the humanities and social sciences that do not recognize the political nature of technology. So this was to clear the grounds. So now the last part, I will go more deeper into these problems concerning freedom and authoritarianism. So it was clear that there was this tension between freedom and effectively dealing with climate change. So how to deal with it then, and how can it be tackled as a philosopher? So one way to tackle it is to think about freedom, and that's what I've done in the Green Leviathan book, which starts with a fictional story where AI is used to globally govern climate change, but doing so by means of coercion and nudging. So kind of AI dictatorship for the good of humankind. So it's a paternalistic idea. And the idea is that humanity cannot deal with freedom. And in Dostoevsky, there's in the Brothers Karamazov, there is a defense of this in the story of the Grand Inquisitor, who says like, yeah, people cannot deal with freedom, so we give them authoritarianism, in that case in the form of a religious kind of authoritarianism. But here one could think of this, as a thought experiment about this green AI, as a green Leviathan. Leviathan is, of course, the figure from the work of Hobbes, who argued that we need some level of authoritarianism in order to make sure that people, if left alone in a state of freedom, they would kill each other, making life nasty with one another. So we need the state as a kind of Leviathan. And here the idea is that if you leave people doing their usual behavior in terms of consumption, goods and services, then you get a nasty kind of climate change, and you get a nasty world in a sense that, and there are all these environmental problems. Now, so it looks like there's a dilemma between, on the one hand, this authoritarian option with no negative freedom meaning interference with what you can do, right? So negative freedom is if is, for example, that if I'm not allowed to drive 180 on the motorway, at least in countries outside Germany. And libertarian freedom is the other option. Then is that you just say like, okay, we leave everyone free. You can do what you want. That's full negative freedom. It looks at first sight, at least, that there is this dilemma between full libertarian freedom versus authoritarian governance in order to deal with climate change. Now, by the way, we are mainly in the libertarian option. I mean, in Europe, we have some environmental laws and so on, but we're mainly in the libertarian side. This distinction between negative and different kind of freedom, negative and positive freedom, comes from Isaiah Berlin, which I find interesting to work with later in the book then. But it's what we see today is, in any case, if we don't deal with, if we don't find other options, then we have only this kind of easy libertarianism and combined with techno-solutionism, or indeed the authoritarian option. So my thought then in the book is, let's develop a better notion of freedom and try out, like, what different notion of freedom could function if that's there are more values and principles that are important, but here I just started from freedom. So let's go in more detail. So Isaiah Berlin also talks about positive freedom, and the kind of positive freedom that I endorse in the book has to do also with democracy. Rousseau proposed positive freedom as self-rule. It's inspired also by capabilities approach, and therefore also human flourishing. So that is not about like leaving me alone, but it's a freedom that is about self-development, about self-mastery and self-rule, both at individual and collective level. And the one reason why we need that kind of freedom, I think, and work towards that, is that we otherwise have this kind of more Hobbesian struggle. And one form that could take is a class struggle between different climate classes, those who benefit from climate change and those who suffer from climate change, for example. And then one can have all this kind of more Marxian thinking in terms of, there will be a rebellion of climate proletariat who might not longer take it. So this kind of directions are quite plausible if it continues. So what should we then do about this? Well, with this more positive notion of freedom, we can think about humans who flourish, but also non-humans who flourish. And so there is a connection then with environmental philosophy. So I think we can have a more inclusive political body, and in this way also, yeah, again, have a notion of freedom that is not only for, in this case, not only for humans, but also for non-humans. And that is about flourishing and not just about leaving alone, about non-interference. So that gets me towards the end of the book, towards a, what I call a poetic political project. Why? Because it's not only about political in a sense of words, and but also about making. So I asked the question, like, how can we make a new common world? That takes, of course, a lot of distance from these libertarian notions of freedom, and connects freedom with a freedom in the polis, a polis that is then radically uh, inclusive, and yeah, a politics that is also about making. So it's not only about this freedom that you get in the public sphere, as opposed to the sphere of making and labor, but a freedom that you gain also through making. So freedom here is also seen as something that you can gain in the household, in work, through work. And I think that connects more with Marxian and feminist notions of politics. So the idea is then that one creates conditions for political freedom as not matter of freeing yourself from creating things and relating to the environment, but as relating to that environment, um, and that in an inclusive way, where the non-humans are also included. Of course, I agree that it's not so easy to go further in thinking about this. I think we can maybe do this in dialogue with Latour, in dialogue with post-humanist thinking, such as Haraway, Braidotti, and so on. But I think this is the kind of normative direction that gets us away from that libertarian freedom, and that in the end also gets us away from a techno-solutionism where technology is in an authoritarian way developed, but where technology itself is also more a way of participating in processes of making, where individuals are not just this kind of atomistic thing you start from, but where political subjects are also made in the process of using both words and things. And yeah, that requires then political technologies and infrastructures that assist this kind of poetics, that assist this making, that assist gathering the new collective, to speak in more Latourian terms. And that also, I think, in the end, necessitates a radical rethinking of communication and communicative action in the political sphere, because then communication is not just about this use of words, but also is about making community in a more poetic way, in a way that includes also this making and this labor. And I think I think if we do this kind of rethinking of freedom, and in the end of the book also the rethinking of politics, at least suggestions for that, then I think that we naturally will have a very different response to climate change. And we have a politics where the sciences are already involved. And we don't have to choose anymore between this either libertarianism and authoritarianism. So I think for technologies such as AI, that means we need that sympoetic, I borrow from Haraway, sympoetic kind of AI that makes us aware that we're all in this together, right? So we are already part of a political collective, and we need then technologies that help us to buy a new political collective around the climate crisis. It's of course easy to say, it's more difficult to do it, but I think that sketches very different lines of political struggle and political action than the usual ones in more classical liberalism, while preserving some liberalist ideas, right? So, I mean, there is still an idea of freedom here, but of course that idea would have to be radically transformed. And finally, I think if we think of this in terms of collectives, we need to ask at least the question, what does it mean at the global level? Maybe we need these global solutions, and therefore also some kind of global collective and global politics. There are good arguments for that. I've given them, but the question is then also in the how, and there also philosophy can help. And I also wonder if environmental philosophers, I mean, I think about this because, of course, many environmental problems are also these global problems. At the end now, I have to say this was about freedom, but I'm very happy also to talk about other principles. I've just done work on AI and democracy, and I've done this book, Why AI Undermines Democracy. I'm not going to talk about this today. In the democracy book, I take a less radical direction, actually, one could say, than in the political Leviathan book. But yeah, I think it's very important to reach for pragmatic reasons to engage with discussions in political philosophy. I think with the Green Leviathan, I've suggested some more radical directions in terms of more radically rethinking a political notion, namely in that case political freedom, and also in suggesting that it could be much more inclusive. Of course, here I also mention it, but I don't go further in it. But with democracy, one could equally try to open up this notion. But this is where I will stop, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.